I hadn't expected the surprise. In fact, I'd been so sure that everything was going according to plan. I had just come back from a week-long teacher's retreat, feeling mentally exhausted but fulfilled. My wife, Clara, had supported my decision to go. She knew how badly I needed the break after what felt like months of nonstop work. We had made plans for a nice dinner when I returned. Just the two of us, something simple but intimate. But nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to walk into. As soon as I turned the corner and walked through the front door, I heard the music, the bass thumping in the living room, mixed with the laughter and loud chatter, was not what I expected after being away for so long. I paused for a moment, feeling the familiar tension of something not quite right. Clara and I had planned this dinner weeks ago. She knew how important it was to me, and I was looking forward to reconnecting after my time away. But instead of the quiet warmth of home, I was met with a party vibe that sent a chill through me. I could feel the anxiety rising in my chest as I walked towards the living room. It didn't help that the music was so loud, pounding against the walls like it was a nightclub. I peeked around the corner, thinking maybe she was just entertaining some friends, a casual thing I could laugh off. But what I saw when I stepped inside stopped me in my tracks. There, in the center of the living room, Clara was standing in a neon green and pink outfit, dancing with two other women. It looked like something out of a ridiculous 80s music video. Bright colors and flashing lights. But it wasn't just her dancing that caught me off guard. The living room had been completely transformed, covered in neon decorations, strobe lights flashing across the walls, a giant inflatable cactus in the corner, and a disco ball hanging from the ceiling. In the middle of all this, Clara was laughing like she hadn't a care in the world. And there, in the middle of the chaos, was Sam, my best friend, my closest confidant. He wasn't just standing off to the side like I would expect. No, he was right there, front and center, dancing way too close to Clara. He was dressed like he had just stepped out of a low-budget DJ gig, complete with a headband and a DJ shirt. But what threw me into a spiral was the way he was interacting with Clara. They were close, too close. His hand casually brushed her arm, his body angled towards hers. And I saw the way they exchanged looks that I had only ever seen between two people who shared something more than just friendship. I froze, standing in the doorway, unable to process the scene unfolding before me. I thought I was dreaming. But no, this was real. This was happening. My best friend, Sam, was flirting with my wife in front of me at our house. I couldn't breathe for a moment, my heart racing faster than I could control it. David, pull it together, I told myself, but my legs refused to move. Sam saw me first. He froze, his smile fading from his face. I could see the panic flash across his eyes, a brief moment of guilt that was quickly replaced by a forced smile. Clara turned around next, her face falling as soon as she saw me. Her hands went up defensively, as if trying to shield herself from my gaze. But the awkwardness of the situation couldn't be masked. David, hey, you're home early, Clara called out, her voice too high-pitched, too fake. I could hear the nervousness in it, and it only made the pit in my stomach grow deeper. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was watch as Clara turned back to the music, trying to act like everything was fine, as if I hadn't just walked in on her in the middle of what could only be described as the most bizarre betrayal I could imagine. Clara, what is this? My voice was barely above a whisper, but the words hit her like a punch. She laughed, but there was no joy in it, just an awkward, forced sound. It's just a little party, David. You know, something fun to blow off some steam. She waved her hand like it was no big deal, but I could see the sweat beading on her forehead. She was panicked. I was panicked, and the more I looked around, the more surreal it became. Sam, who had been quiet until then, finally spoke up. It's not what you think, man. He gave me a nervous smile, but the words rang hollow. We were just having some fun. No big deal. A part of me wanted to scream, to demand answers right there. But another part of me was paralyzed. How could they do this? Why would Clara, my wife, do this? And why Sam? Of all people. My mind reeled, and my stomach churned with betrayal. Fun, I managed to croak, trying to stay calm, but my voice cracked. You call this fun? I gestured around the room, at the inflatable cactus, at the people still dancing, and at the ridiculous party that was unfolding as if nothing was wrong. Felt like I was losing control of everything. Clara's smile faded, and she stepped forward, trying to approach me. David, please, is not what you think. You've been away and I just needed some space. Sam and I were just trying to lighten the mood. Her words didn't make sense. They didn't even sound like her. The Clara I knew wouldn't do something like this. The Clara I knew wouldn't betray me. But here we were, and I couldn't escape it. I looked at Sam. He was fidgeting, looking at the ground, his nervous energy almost palpable. I didn't mean for things to get out of hand, David. Really? He stammered. It's just, I thought Clara needed a change. She was feeling overwhelmed. And stop, I shouted, the words spilling out before I could stop them. The noise in the room dropped, and all eyes were on me. The guests, the dancers, everyone. Just stop. You don't get to explain this away. Not like this. Not in my house. For a moment there was silence. The reality of the situation settled in, and I felt a wave of anger hit me like a freight train. My best friend, my wife, in my own home, and all I could do was stand there, looking at them in disbelief. I'm done. I don't want to hear any more, I said. My voice was calm, but I could feel the rage burning in my chest. Both of you, leave, now. Clara looked at me, her face twisting with frustration. David, please, she said. But I turned my back and walked towards the door, the sound of the party and their voices fading behind me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. All I knew was that my world was crashing down, and I couldn't stop it. The next morning was nothing short of chaos. I couldn't believe what had happened the night before. It felt like a bad dream, but when I looked around at the mess that remained, a toppled vase, crushed party streamers, the faint smell of tequila and regret, I knew it was real. My head was pounding, and my body felt like it had been run over by a truck. I barely remembered going to bed, but I knew I hadn't slept well. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that living room, the sound of the music and Clara's laughter ringing in my ears. Ethan's voice brought me out of my daze. Dad, what's going on? I woke up and heard shouting last night. Was that you and Mom? I turned to see him standing at the hallway entrance, his eyes tired and wide, his hair messy from sleep. He looked more grown up than usual, as if the night had aged him too. My heart ached at the thought of how much this would hurt him. Ethan, come sit with me, I said, motioning to the couch as I rubbed my face, feeling the rough stubble that had grown overnight. He hesitated, but the look in my eyes must have told him this was serious. He sat down beside me, his knees drawn up to his chest. Last night, your mom and I had an argument, I said, trying to sound casual, though the tightness in my throat made it impossible. It's going to be okay. Why were there so many people just need here? Some time. And why was Sam there, Dad? You always said Sam was, your best friend, he said, his voice catching as he tried to make sense of it. I looked at him and felt a pang of guilt. Ethan had always been perceptive, a quiet observer. He saw more than I sometimes gave him credit for, and the betrayal wasn't just mine to bear. It was his too. Ethan, listen to me, I said, turning to face him fully. I don't know how to explain it, but what you saw last night, it's not what it seemed. I'll make sure you're okay, I promise. The doorbell rang, cutting off any further conversation. My heart clenched as I stood up to answer it, already dreading who would be waiting on the other side. I didn't need to see him, but there he was, Sam. His face looked pale, tired, and remorseful, as if he knew the wreckage he'd left behind. David, he said, his voice a mix of guilt and desperation. Can we talk? I didn't respond immediately. I looked back at Ethan, who was now watching the interaction, his brows knitted in confusion and concern. I needed to protect him from this mess, but Sam's presence was unavoidable. Ethan, go to your room. Okay? We'll talk later, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He hesitated, glancing between Sam and me, but finally nodded and retreated up the stairs. casting a wary glance over his shoulder. I opened the door wider, allowing Sam to step inside. He hesitated at first, then took a seat on the armchair, his hands clasped tightly together. The room was quiet, the morning sun streaming through the window but not bright enough to chase away the shadow that hung over us. I need to know what the hell was going on last night, Sam. Why was Clara? Why were you too? I swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising anger. It wasn't supposed to be like that, he said, running a hand through his hair. Clara asked me to help her organize a party. She wanted to surprise you when you came back. And I thought it would be a good thing, you know? Something to take the pressure off. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A party? In our living room? With that ridiculous setup? I gestured to the mess. The last remnants of neon decorations still scattered around like they were mocking me. And you thought it would be good? Do you have any idea how that looked? How it made me feel? I know, he said, his voice breaking. I didn't know she would take it that far. I thought it was just going to be a few friends. Some music. Nothing like what it turned out to be. I can't believe this, I said, shaking my head. You're my best friend, Sam. We've known each other for years. How did you think I'd react to this? And Clara, she's my wife. I can't believe she would. I know. I can't tell you how sorry I am. I messed up, David. I didn't want any of this to happen. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. But the anger was there, simmering just beneath the surface. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him how he had betrayed me, how he'd taken something sacred and shattered it in an instant. But the truth was, he wasn't the only one at fault. I had known Clara long enough to understand that she was a complicated person, full of contradictions, and that there were pieces of her I had never understood. I need some space, Sam. I can't do this right now, I said, my voice low and tired. He stood up, nodding, his face etched with regret. I get it. I'll leave. But David, please, don't make any hasty decisions about Clara. I know her better than anyone. She's not a bad person. She just made a mistake. He left without another word. And I stood there, listening to the sound of the front door closing. The weight of it all settled into my bones, and I suddenly felt so very, very alone. The silence was broken by Ethan's footsteps coming down the stairs. I looked at him, and he looked back at me, eyes wide with questions I didn't know how to answer. Dad, is everything okay? He asked cautiously. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to force a reassuring smile. Not right now, Ethan, but we'll figure it out. Okay? I promise. He nodded slowly, though I could tell he didn't believe me. And in that moment, neither did I. The road ahead felt uncertain and treacherous, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't done fighting for my family, for the life we'd built together, even if it meant facing truths that hurt more than I could have ever imagined. The days that followed were a blur of tension and sleepless nights. Clara avoided me, her presence in the house barely more than a shadow. When she did speak, it was only to confirm the most mundane of things. I'm taking Ethan to school. I'll be home late. Her eyes never met mine, her voice thin and tight. The silence between us was deafening, a tangible reminder of the fractured trust that now lay between us. I spent my days at work, though I could barely focus. My mind was consumed with images of Clara and Sam, memories of them laughing together. That look in their eyes that said so much more than words ever could. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, and every time I opened them, reality clawed at me again. Ethan was the only constant, the only reason I kept moving forward. He kept me grounded, though his silence spoke volumes. I'd find him staring out the window, watching the world go by like he was waiting for something to change. I didn't have the heart to tell him it wouldn't. It was on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after the party, that Clara finally spoke to me, and it wasn't even to my face. I was in the kitchen, staring into the sink, when I heard her voice calling from the hallway. I glanced up to see her standing there, arms crossed over her chest, eyes guarded. The sight of her made my chest tighten. I need to talk to you, she said, voice small but defiant. I nodded, motioning for her to come in. My body tensed as she walked closer, the air between us electric and full of unsaid words. "I'm sorry for everything," she started, her voice wavering. "For what happened that night. I never wanted any of this, David. It was a stupid mistake. Sam and I held up my hand, cutting her off before the guilt could twist any more in my chest. "Clara, I don't need an explanation. I need to know where we go from here. I need to know if we're even still us." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I needed to see her raw, needed to know she was feeling even a fraction of the hurt I was. "I don't know," she admitted, the tremble in her voice making my chest ache. "I wish I did, but I don't." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but instead I forced myself to take a deep breath. "What about Ethan?" I asked quietly. "What are we going to tell him?" Clara's face fell. "He already knows, David. He heard us fighting. He saw you that night when you walked out." I felt as though the floor had been pulled out from under me. My son knew. He knew that his parents were on the brink of falling apart, that the home he'd always known was breaking down. The weight of that realization pressed on my chest, making it hard to breathe. "We need to make this right," I said, my voice low. "For Ethan's sake, if nothing else." "I want that too," Clara said, the first flicker of hope in her eyes. "But we have to figure out if we can forgive each other, if we can ever go back to what we had." "Clara, I don't know if I can forgive you, and I don't know if I even want to," I said, my voice catching. "But I do know one thing. I need to keep this family together, even if that means facing the hardest choices I've ever made." There was a long pause as we stared at each other. Two people who had once known each other so well but were now strangers. The air was thick, electric, the silence louder than any words we could have said. I had to move, had to break the tension. "Do you know where Sam is?" I asked, surprising even myself. The question had come out before I could stop it, but once it was out there, I needed the defiance in them flaring up. "Why do you care?" she spat. "Are you going to confront him again?" "I'm going to deal with this," I said, my voice harder than I intended. "But this isn't just about you and me anymore, Clara. It's about Ethan, and it's about what kind of life we're going to give him from here on out." A knock at the front door interrupted us, and we both flinched, eyes meeting in a moment of panic. I glanced toward the hallway, heart pounding. No one else should have been coming by. Clara bit her lip, and I knew she was as unsettled as I was. I walked to the door, my hands shaking as I gripped the knob. When I opened it, standing there with a determined look and a bag slung over his shoulder, was Sam. "I need to talk to you," he said, his eyes darting over my shoulder to Clara. The tension in the air thickened, the space between us crackling with unspoken words. "You have exactly 5 minutes," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. This was it, the confrontation I'd been dreading, the one that would set the stage for what came next. Sam stepped inside, and Clara's expression darkened as she followed him into the living room. "I'm not here to justify what happened," Sam said, breaking the silence. "But I am here to say I'm sorry for everything. To both of you." The guilt in his voice was palpable, and I felt a strange mixture of anger and relief. At least he was here, at least he knew he had wronged me. But the road to understanding and resolution was still a long way off, and I had no idea how we were going to get there. The silence after Sam's apology was suffocating, as if the room had been sealed tight with nothing left to breathe. Clara stood by the doorway, her arms folded, her expression unreadable. I wasn't sure if I was angry or relieved that Sam had shown up, but I knew one thing for certain. His presence had brought everything back to the surface, and there was no ignoring it anymore. 5 minutes? I repeated, my voice low and strained. I didn't trust myself to say anything more without losing control. Sam shifted uncomfortably on the edge of the couch, glancing nervously between Clara and me. I wanted to scream at him, to demand how he could betray me like this, how he could be so reckless, so utterly selfish. But I kept my fists clenched at my sides and forced myself to take a breath. "David, I know I don't have the right to ask for anything from you, but I need you to understand," Sam said, his voice steady but edged with regret. What happened between Clara and me was a mistake, a terrible one, but it didn't mean anything. I swear to you, it was a moment of weakness, and I've spent every day since regretting it. Clara's eyes welled up with tears, and she looked away, her voice barely a whisper. Sam, you don't have to do this. I've already made things worse. I'm here because I want to make it right, Sam said, cutting in before Clara could finish. His eyes met mine, and for a second, I saw a flicker of the man I had once called my friend. The man who had been there when I needed him, who had laughed with me at stupid jokes and helped me build the life I now had. But the memory faded fast, and the betrayal settled back in, heavy and suffocating. I'm not sure how you can fix this, Sam. How do you fix what you've done? I asked, my voice shaking. This isn't just about you and Clara. This is about everything I thought I knew, everything that I believed in. Sam nodded, understanding the gravity of my words, but it didn't make it easier. I know, and I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know that I never wanted to hurt you. If I could go back and change it, I would. There was a long silence as I struggled to process his words. My head was pounding, a dull throb that felt like it might crack my skull open. What did I want? What could I possibly want now? Clara's face looked haggard, her eyes rimmed with red. She looked as broken as I felt, and the reality that we were both standing on the brink of losing everything hit me like a wave. Sam, I need you to leave, I said finally, my voice steely. I don't know what your place is in this anymore, but I need some time to think. Clara and we have to figure out what we're doing. Sam's face fell, but he nodded, standing up slowly. He didn't say a word, didn't protest, and I almost respected him for that. The door clicked shut behind him, and I turned to see Clara staring at the spot where he had just stood. David? She whispered, and for the first time in weeks, her voice broke with emotion. I don't know what to do anymore. I've never been this lost. I stepped forward, my heart aching at the sight of her, at the raw pain in her eyes. It was impossible not to feel it, impossible not to wish we could go back to the way things were before everything had shattered. But there was no going back. There was only the slow, painful work of figuring out what came next. We need to talk, I said softer now. We need to figure out if this is something we can rebuild or if it's time to move on. For Ethan's sake and for ours. Clara's eyes met mine, and I saw a flicker of hope there. Fragile and delicate. Maybe we weren't beyond repair. Maybe there was a chance, even a small one, that we could mend what was broken. The next few days were a whirlwind of conversations, half-spoken apologies, and awkward silences. Ethan was the only one who seemed to be keeping things normal, making small jokes and asking me to play basketball in the driveway. I took his lead, trying to keep a sense of normalcy for him, even though the world I had known was slipping through my fingers. The guilt of not being the father I wanted to be weighed heavily on me, and I found myself wondering if I could ever find it within myself to forgive Clara, or even Sam. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table, the remnants of dinner still scattered around me, Clara walked in. Her eyes were tired but focused, and she pulled out the chair opposite me without a word. I set my fork down and met her gaze. I've been thinking, she said, her voice firm. I can't keep pretending that everything's okay. We need to face this, David. And I need to know if there's any chance we can fix this. I took a deep breath, the question hanging between us. I didn't have an answer, but I knew one thing. It was too late for easy solutions. Whatever we decided, the road ahead would be long and uncertain. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I wondered if it would be worth it. Maybe we can, I said, the words tasting foreign on my tongue. But we need to be honest with each other. No more lies, no more secrets. Clara nodded, tears welling up in her eyes once more. No more secrets. I'm ready to face whatever comes next, David. I stood up and walked over to the window, staring out into the darkness. The night was calm, too calm for the storm raging inside me. We had a long way to go, but I couldn't help the flicker of hope that sparked, however faintly, in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back. The days that followed felt like a tightrope walk over an abyss. Clara and I spoke more than we had in weeks, each conversation a hesitant step forward. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were teetering on the edge of something we couldn't control. It was exhausting, this new version of us. Two people bound by shared history but torn apart by betrayal. Still, we tried. We shared meals at the table, even if the silence between bites was as loud as a shout. And we took turns helping Ethan with his homework. A fragile reminder that we were still a family, the knock or at least trying to be. It was so sudden, so loud that I nearly jumped out of my skin. Clara and I exchanged a look, the kind that said, "What now?" Ethan, sensing the tension, watched from the living room, eyes wide with uncertainty. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding, and opened the door to find Sam standing there, a hesitant smile on his face. "I need to talk to you," he said, stepping in before I could respond. His eyes flicked to Clara, who stood frozen, a plate in her hand like it was a shield. The air between us thickened as Sam turned back to me. "What is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. I knew he wasn't here just to apologize again. There was something urgent, something that made my stomach churn with dread. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you after everything, but I need to tell you something," Sam said, his voice low and strained. He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what he was about to say. "Go on," I said, dreading what would come next. Clara shifted uncomfortably, the muscles in her jaw tightening. "Clara, I didn't just come here to make amends or to beg for your forgiveness," Sam continued. He looked at her, eyes softening with guilt. "I came because I need you to know that I'm in danger. Someone's coming for me, someone who wants to hurt me, and they know about you." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Clara gasped, the plate slipping from her hand and shattering on the floor. Ethan jumped, his eyes darting from me to Sam. Confusion etched on his young face. The pieces of my life had been so carefully shuffled into place. And now, with Sam's words hanging in the air, I realized how fragile they really were. "What are you talking about?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's not just me," Sam said, taking a step forward, eyes wild and urgent. "They're coming for you too. I tried to warn you, but I didn't think they'd get this close." I felt a surge of anger mixed with disbelief. "You're telling me this now? After everything that's happened? Do you think this will make things better, Sam?" "David, listen to me," Sam said, desperation making his voice sharp. "I didn't have a choice. They've been following me, and I didn't know how to stop them. But they're here now, and if we don't act, it's not just my life on the line." Clara's eyes were wide with panic. The color drained from her face. She grabbed my arm, her fingers trembling. "David, what does he mean? What's going on?" "I don't know," I muttered, trying to make sense of the chaos swirling in my mind. It was one thing to deal with betrayal, another to be thrust into this kind of danger. I glanced at Sam, searching for some semblance of clarity, but found only fear. This was no longer just about us or Ethan. It was something much bigger, something that could threaten everything we had left. "Who's coming for you?" I demanded, the words coming out harsher than I intended. Sam's face darkened. "People from my past, people I thought I'd left behind. They're ruthless, and they don't forgive." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to think. Couldn't let panic take over, not now. "Clara, we need to get Ethan out of here," I said, my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. What dovedo?" Sam's eyes darted around the room, landing on Clara, then me. "We leave. We go somewhere they won't find us. Somewhere they don't know about. They won't stop until they get what they want." It was as if the floor had been pulled out from under me. The past few weeks had already been a whirlwind of emotional turmoil. And now this? A threat I couldn't even comprehend? Clara looked like she might faint, her eyes wide with shock and terror. I wanted to hold her, to tell her that everything would be okay. But I couldn't make that promise. I didn't know if it would be. "What about the house?" Clara whispered. "What about Ethan's life?" "It's not safe here," Sam said, voice rough. "We need to move now." I glanced at Ethan, who was staring at Sam with a mix of awe and fear. His childhood had been stripped away, piece by piece, and now the final semblance of safety was gone. I kneeled down to him, brushing his dark hair from his forehead. Ethan, listen to me. We have to go somewhere for a little while. It's just for now, okay? I promise we'll come back. He nodded slowly, eyes wide and tearful, but I could see the trust in them. He believed me even when I wasn't sure I believed myself. Clara, we need to pack now, I said, my voice soft but firm. The weight of the moment pressed down on me like a lead blanket, but I knew what needed to be done. We had to move before the danger came crashing down on us. Clara turned to me, eyes searching mine, and I saw a flicker of determination mixed with fear. This was a new kind of challenge, one that neither of us had ever faced. And as we gathered what little we could, I knew one thing. Whatever was coming, we would face it together no matter what the cost. The night was an eerie blend of urgency and silence as Clara and I stuffed our most essential belongings into duffel bags. The sound of zippers opening and closing, the clatter of shoes against the hardwood floor, and the occasional rustle of fabric were the only noises that broke the stillness. Ethan sat in the corner, his knees pulled up to his chest, staring at the scene unfolding in front of him. I couldn't meet his eyes, couldn't bear to see the confusion and fear in them. He was too young to understand that life could turn so violently, so unexpectedly. Sam stood by the front door, glancing out the window, his back tense as if every sound could be a signal of danger. His pale skin glistened with a thin layer of sweat, and his hands were fidgeting, the knuckles white from clenching too hard. He looked at me, and for a moment, our eyes locked with an understanding that neither of us wanted to admit. We were both terrified. David, we need to go, Sam said, voice hoarse. I nodded, grabbing one last bag and looking at Clara. The strong, proud woman who had once been so confident was now fragile, her eyes red and raw. I caught her looking at Ethan, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the fierce protectiveness in her gaze, a reminder of why we were doing this. Ethan, we're going on a trip, okay? Clara said, her voice trying to sound light but cracking under the weight of the moment. It's going to be an adventure, and I need you to be brave for me. Ethan nodded, but his eyes were still wide with the kind of fear that only comes from sensing danger without understanding it. I knelt beside him, my heart twisting with guilt. He deserved better than this, a life free from the shadows that had crept into ours. Everything will be all right, I whispered, my hand on his shoulder. I hoped my voice was convincing enough to reassure him, but it trembled, betraying my own fear. We piled into the car, the weight of our hastily packed bags pressing against us as if they were trying to keep us from escaping. The engine roared to life, the sound cutting through the silence of the night as I pulled out of the driveway and onto the darkened road. The streetlights flickered as we drove past them, the beam of light flashing through the windows like a warning. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, my chest tightening each time I thought I saw headlights trailing behind us. But it was always just the distant glow of traffic, safe and mundane. The first hour was almost peaceful, just the hum of the tires on the road and the occasional sound of Ethan shifting in the back seat. Clara sat in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly together, her face turned toward the window. I knew she was trying to think of a future that wasn't painted in terror and uncertainty, but I couldn't think that far ahead. I focused only on the now, on keeping us safe and moving forward. As we approached the outskirts of town, Sam leaned forward, his voice low. We need to turn off soon. There's a back road that leads to the old cabin in the woods. It's the only place they won't find us. Are you sure? I asked, my voice clipped. The more I learned about this situation, the more questions I had. What kind of people were we dealing with? Why had Sam gotten mixed up with them? And most importantly, what would happen if we couldn't escape their reach? I'm sure. It's been years since anyone's been there, and I made sure it's still secure. The road narrowed, the faint glow of the city now replaced with the dense shadow of trees that seemed to rise up around us like a wall. Clara reached for my hand, her fingers cool and clammy. I squeezed them, trying to send her the courage I was clinging to, piece by fragile piece. The branches scraped the sides of the car, their skeletal fingers reaching out, as if trying to pull us back. I forced myself to focus on the narrow path ahead, the gravel crunching beneath the tires as we drove deeper into the woods. The cabin appeared suddenly, framed by tall pines and the dim light of the moon filtering through the branches. It was old, with weathered wood and a roof that sagged under the weight of age. But it was still standing, and it was all we had. I pulled the car up close, cutting the engine and letting the silence return. The chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl were the only sounds, a cruel reminder that the world was still turning, indifferent to our plight. "We're here," I said, though my voice felt small against the vastness of the forest. Sam got out first, surveying the area with eyes that darted from shadow to shadow. He moved with the practiced ease of someone who had been hunted, who knew that even the smallest sound could be a threat. Clara stepped out, her eyes wide as she took in the cabin and the eerie silence that surrounded it. I didn't know if this was a safe haven or just a temporary reprieve, but I knew we had to make the most of it. "Ethan, stay close," I said, my voice firm as he hopped out of the car, his expression a mix of curiosity and fear. Sam unlocked the door, the rusty hinges protesting with a loud creak as he pushed it open. The inside was dim, the smell of damp wood and old memories seeping into my lungs. There was no comfort here, no warmth, only the stark realization that we were hiding, that our lives had been reduced to the mere act of survival. "We need to stay alert," Sam said, turning to face us. "They'll be looking for us, and it's only a matter of time before they find us here." I nodded, feeling the weight of that truth settle deep in my bones. Whatever came next, I knew one thing. This was only the beginning. The cabin creaked and groaned under the weight of silence, the kind that comes when you know you're being hunted, but can't quite tell where the predator lies. We were safe for now, but the safety felt as thin as paper, ready to be torn apart at any moment. Clara and Ethan had settled into the corner, the flickering light from a dusty lantern casting long, twisting shadows across their faces. I couldn't stop pacing, the tension coiling in my muscles until they felt like they might snap. Sam stood at the window, peering out into the darkness, eyes darting with each sound that reached our ears. The wind whistling through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of something unseen. It felt like hours had passed, but in reality, it had only been minutes. We all knew we couldn't stay here for long, but we didn't know where we could go or how we would get there. The road behind us had already been covered, every exit planned and every move watched. They were out there somewhere waiting. "David, we need to make a plan," Sam said, his voice low and strained. I couldn't tell if it was fear or exhaustion that made him sound so defeated, but the raw edge of it cut through the room. "What kind of plan, Sam? They're coming for us. There's no way we can just vanish," I said, the weight of my voice making it hard to breathe. Clara looked up at me, her eyes wide with worry. She knew it too, the reality that running was no longer an option. We had to face this no matter how much we wished we could turn back time. Sam shifted, taking a long breath before continuing. "They won't expect us to make a stand. If we make it look like we're not afraid, they might hesitate. I know it's risky, but it's better than running from shadow to shadow." I shook my head, torn between disbelief and the desperate need to hold on to any semblance of hope. "We can't just fight them, Sam. We're outnumbered and outmatched." "David, we don't have a choice," Sam said, the desperation in his eyes giving way to something else. A spark, a plan, however thin and improbable it seemed, was taking form in his mind. I felt the shift, the moment when fear gave way to action. We were going to fight. Clara pushed herself up, brushing her dark hair from her face and forcing herself to stand tall, even as the tremor in her hands betrayed her. "Then we fight," she said, and there was something in her voice that reminded me of the woman I first fell in love with, the warrior spirit she had hidden beneath her calm exterior. If we were going to make it, we needed to stand together. The three of us, united in the face of something we couldn't fully grasp but knew would test us beyond our limits. Sam and I discussed the plan while Clara kept a vigilant eye on Ethan, who was now curled up in the corner, hugging his knees to his chest. He was so small, so innocent, and the thought of what could happen to him made my blood run cold. I knew I had to be strong for him, even if my legs were shaking and my mind was filled with doubt. The next hour was spent gathering anything we could use as a weapon or a shield. Broken pieces of wood from the old furniture, the rusty metal of the cabin stove, anything that could give us an advantage. Clara found an old rifle tucked away in a dusty corner, its metal cold and unfamiliar in her hands. She looked at me with eyes that said, "I can do this." I nodded, too afraid to speak, afraid that my voice would break and betray my fear. When the first noise came, it was so sudden that it felt like a gunshot. Sam raised his hand and we all fell into position. I stood by the doorway, fingers wrapped around a jagged piece of wood I'd found, heart pounding as the sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel outside reached us. "They're here," Sam said, his voice barely above a whisper. My fingers tightened on the wood, the sharp edges digging into my skin, and I braced myself. The darkness outside felt as if it were pressing in, and I knew we had to act fast or it would all be over before it even began. The door creaked as it swung open, and two men stepped inside, their faces obscured by shadows but their intent clear in the way they moved. Clara raised the rifle, her hands trembling but resolute. One of the men stepped forward, the gleam of a knife catching the light. "David," Sam called, a warning that came too late. The room erupted into chaos. The next moments were a blur of motion, the sound of shouting, the thud of heavy boots on the wooden floor, the clatter of furniture as we pushed it aside to create a barrier. Clara shouted for Ethan to stay down, and I lunged at one of the intruders, the jagged wood in my hands biting into my palm as I swung it with all the strength I had. Felt as if time slowed. I could see the shock in the man's eyes as I drove the makeshift weapon toward him, the way his mouth opened in a silent gasp as he stumbled back. But there was no time to savor it. Sam had grabbed a rusted metal rod and was swinging at another man, his movements fierce, the fight bringing out a rage that seemed to consume him. The cabin was a cacophony of noise, the kind that drowns out reason and makes you believe you're fighting for your life, for everything that matters. We had to hold them off, had to find a way to win, even if the odds were stacked against us. The men outside were only the beginning, and I knew that if we didn't take control now, there would be no tomorrow. The scream cut through the air, and my heart stopped. "Clara." I turned just in time to see her fall, the rifle clattering to the floor as she tried to rise. My blood roared in my ears, and I lunged toward her, desperation clawing at my throat as I grabbed her and pulled her away from the chaos. And I didn't wait to see if Sam would follow. I pulled Clara to her feet, the panic in her eyes mirrored in mine as we scrambled toward the back of the cabin. Ethan was already moving, his small legs carrying him as fast as they could. The night was still waiting, dark and unyielding, but we were fighting for our survival. It wasn't over yet, and I knew that when we stepped into the unknown, we would either find freedom or face a fate worse than we had ever imagined. The dense woods seemed to close in around us as we fled, the branches clawing at our faces and clothes like they were trying to keep us from escaping. Clara's breathing was ragged, and Ethan's small hand gripped mine so tightly I could feel the warmth of his palm searing into my skin. I dared not look back. I didn't want to see the shadowy figures emerging from the cabin, or hear the voices calling out to us, sharp with anger and determination. We kept running, the ground beneath our feet slick with wet leaves and the occasional roots threatening to trip us up. My chest burned, and I could taste the metallic tang of fear mixed with the cold night air. Every step felt like a battle against gravity, but I pushed on, refusing to look back. "David," Clara called out, her voice frantic. I glanced to my left, catching the flicker of her silhouette illuminated by the pale moonlight. Her eyes were wide, darting over her shoulder, but she kept running. I couldn't let her falter. Not now, not when we were so close to the edge of this nightmare. "What is it?" I shouted, though I could barely hear my own voice over the thumping of my heart. "There's another way," she said, panting as she reached out, grabbing my arm. "There's a path through the woods. If we take it, we can get to the old bridge." The old bridge. I remembered it from when I was a kid. A wooden structure barely wide enough to hold a single car. It was rickety and creaked with every step, but it was also the only way to cross the river that would take us away from this place. My chest tightened. a mixture of dread and hope washing over me. "Lead the way," I said, and Clara nodded. Her jaw set as she surged forward, her steps light and quick despite the exhaustion in her body. I could feel Ethan's little heart pounding against my side as we navigated through the tangled trees. His legs were growing weary, but his eyes were wide, unblinking. The boy I had known since he was a baby was now carrying the burden of survival in a way no child should. I wanted to tell him everything would be okay, that the worst was behind us, but I couldn't. We weren't out of the woods yet. Literally or figuratively, a sound in the distance caught my attention. The unmistakable roar of an engine. My blood turned cold, and my feet faltered as I glanced behind us. The glint of headlights sliced through the darkness, illuminating the path we had taken. They were coming, and I knew that if we didn't reach the bridge soon, we would be trapped. "Keep going," I shouted, my voice cracking as I urged Clara and Ethan forward. The path grew narrower, the trees pressing in, their twisted limbs creating an almost impenetrable wall of darkness. I could hear Clara's sharp breaths and the soft, frightened whimpers from Ethan. Every second felt like an eternity, the fear tightening around me like a vice. Finally, a break in the trees appeared, a clearing that led to the edge of the riverbank. I saw the bridge in the distance, its wooden planks swaying in the breeze, the water below dark and churning. It was more terrifying than I remembered, its thin structure seeming to teeter on the edge of collapse. But there was no choice, we had to cross it. "Ethan, stay close to me," I said as I pulled him up to my side. Clara was already a few steps ahead, her eyes focused on the path ahead, but I could see the tension in her shoulders as she prepared herself to cross. The engine noise behind us grew louder, and a shout split the night. The pursuers were close. We had to move now. Clara set one foot on the bridge, the old wood creaking in protest beneath her weight. The moonlight caught her silhouette, making her look like a ghost moving across the chasm. I followed, the air around us charged with the sense of imminent danger. The bridge swayed, a sickening lurch making my heart skip a beat. Ethan's small body trembled against my side, his eyes wide with terror as he glanced down at the river below. "Don't look down," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just keep your eyes on me." The sounds of shouting grew louder, and I risked a glance over my shoulder. I could see two dark figures at the edge of the clearing, the moonlight reflecting off the metal of their weapons. They hadn't seen the bridge yet, but it was only a matter of time. "Almost there," Clara called, her voice strained but determined as she stepped off the bridge onto the far side of the riverbank. I could see the relief in her eyes, a moment of hope before the reality of the danger caught up with us again. Ethan followed next, his legs shaking but his eyes fixed on mine, trusting me to lead him to safety. The noise behind us suddenly became louder, the sound of boots pounding the ground and the roar of the engine on the verge of reaching the clearing. I felt a sickening twist of dread. There was no way we could outrun them now. I had to make a choice. "Clara, go," I shouted, the urgency clawing at my throat. "Take Ethan and get as far as you can." "No," she screamed, turning to look back at me. "We don't leave you behind. You have to," I said, my voice breaking. "Go. Now." Clara hesitated for a second too long, and in that moment, the first of the pursuers burst into the clearing, their dark figures silhouetted against the moonlight. There was no time for anything else. I pushed Ethan toward Clara, my eyes locked with hers for just a moment before I turned to face the oncoming threat. The world fell away, and I steadied my breath, my body coiling as I prepared for what was coming. This was it, my last stand. I knew I might not make it out, but I wouldn't let them take my family. Not now, not ever. The future was still waiting, and as long as I had breath left in me, I would fight for it. The roar of the engine behind me was deafening, a heartbeat of violence that threatened to shatter my resolve. I felt the weight of every decision I had made pressing down on me, suffocating but solid. Clara and Ethan were safe, or at least as safe as they could be, and I would be damned if I let anything happen to them now. "David," Sam's voice cut through the chaos, but I didn't turn. I knew he was behind me, still scrambling across the bridge, his silhouette stark against the moonlit night. The shouts of our pursuers were growing louder, echoing in the woods like a promise of doom. I felt the tension in the air, the sharpness of the moment, and every muscle in my body coiled with the anticipation of the fight. Two figures emerged from the trees, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the campfire that had been burning back at the cabin. Their eyes were dark, hungry, and I could see the weapons in their hands, gleaming ominously under the pale light. They were coming for me, and in the silence between heartbeats, I made my choice. I stepped forward, my pulse thundering in my ears as I prepared to face them. The wood beneath my feet groaned, but I didn't look down. I didn't have the luxury of fear, not now. A part of me felt detached, like this was happening to someone else. This was not just a fight for survival. This was the final stand of a man determined to protect the only family he had left. "Get across," I shouted at Sam, who hesitated, his face a mask of disbelief. I saw him open his mouth to protest, but then the figures were on me, and there was no time for anything else. A vicious swipe with a knife aimed at my chest. I ducked, sidestepping and grabbing his arm in a vice-like grip. My other fist connected with his jaw, the impact sending a shockwave up my arm. He staggered backward, eyes wide with surprise and pain. Before he could recover, I swept his legs out from under him, sending him sprawling into the dirt. The second man came at me, but this time I was ready. I grabbed a branch from the ground and swung it with all the force I could muster, catching him across the chest. He gasped, stumbling back, but I didn't wait to see if he would recover. "Sam now," I yelled, my voice raw with exertion. I could hear Sam's hurried footsteps as he raced toward the bridge's end. The moonlight caught his silhouette as he grabbed Clara's arm, and I saw her eyes flick to me, wide and full of worry. I forced a smile that I hoped conveyed strength, though it felt hollow. "Go," I roared again, my voice shaking. They had to leave. There was no other way. Clara's eyes met mine one last time before she turned and pulled Ethan toward the safety of the forest on the other side of the river. The shouts behind me intensified, and I knew they had heard. My blood ran cold as I realized that what I was doing was reckless, that I was risking everything. But there was no alternative. I would not let them pay for my choices. The man I had knocked down earlier had recovered, and now he was charging at me, rage contorting his features. We collided, and the force of it sent a jolt of pain through my body as we crashed against the side of the bridge. I slammed my knee into his stomach, forcing the air from his lungs, and as he doubled over, I twisted the knife from his hand and drove it into the wood beside us. The bridge creaked in protest, but I didn't stop. I shoved him off me, pushing him to the edge, but before he could go over, he grabbed my arm, pulling me forward with a snarl. I fought for control, but he was stronger, his grip like iron. Just as I felt my feet leave the ground, there was a flash of movement in the darkness. A loud crack split the air, and the man's grip loosened as he looked down at the small, bloodied wound that had appeared in his chest. He let out a strangled gasp, eyes wide with shock as he fell backward, disappearing into the river below. I staggered back, catching myself on the splintered edge of the bridge. "David!" Sam's voice was frantic now, his body half on the bridge, half on the ground. I looked over, and there was Clara, holding Ethan, her eyes wide and teary. They were safe for now. The moment of relief was brief, but it was enough. I nodded, unable to say the words that I knew she needed to hear. It was enough to see her and Ethan safe, to know that the threat had passed, at least for a moment. The second man lay still at the other end of the bridge, his breath ragged as he tried to lift himself. He looked up at me, rage burning in his eyes, but he was no longer a threat. I turned away, taking one last look at Clara and Ethan before I jumped down to the edge of the riverbank. The night air was cool, cutting at my sweat-drenched skin, and I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. My legs felt like lead, but I forced them to move, stumbling forward through the dense woods toward the distant sounds of safety. The river stretched out before me, dark and wide, but it was the path I would take, the path that led to freedom. I wasn't sure what lay ahead, or if the danger had truly passed, But as I pressed on, the feeling that I had done what I needed to do filled me with a fragile hope. I was alive and they were safe, and that was enough.